Giving birth at 70 years old defies everything we think we know about the human body. For Evelyn Grant, it seemed like a miracle at first. Her daughter was healthy, the delivery was successful, and the world was calling it a blessing. But something was wrong, something the doctors hadn't seen yet. And when they finally did, they called her back to the hospital immediately, praying it wasn't already too late. Stay tuned to discover the shocking truth the doctors uncovered, and tell us in comments where you're watching from. No one expected Evelyn Grant to become a mother at 70. Not her doctors, not her husband Robert, and certainly not Evelyn herself. Yet here she was, cradling a healthy baby girl in her arms, tears of disbelief tracing lines down her weathered cheeks. They named her Hope. The hospital room buzzed with hushed amazement. Nurses smiled softly. Doctors whispered outside the door. A miracle, they called it, a once-in-a-lifetime event. But while the world celebrated, Evelyn couldn't ignore the way Robert stood by the window, arms crossed, saying nothing. He hadn't held the baby since the delivery. He hadn't even looked her in the eye. 3 days later, as Evelyn prepared to be discharged, a nurse entered the room with an odd expression. "We'll need to run a few final checks before you go," she said carefully. "Just routine." Evelyn nodded, distracted by the ache in her lower back and the softness of the child in her arms. She was too tired to ask questions. She didn't know then that those routine checks would soon blow their lives wide open. Months before the birth, Evelyn had noticed small changes, ones she brushed off without much thought. She felt heavier, slower. Her clothes tightened around her waist, but she blamed retirement. "I'm just not moving as much," she told herself. Afternoon naps became unavoidable. Her energy vanished. Then came the nausea. Subtle at first, then relentless. It wasn't like anything she remembered from decades ago. This time, it lingered, creeping in while she cooked, while she read, while she sat quietly alone. She started skipping meals. Robert noticed, but didn't ask questions. He just brought her tea and went back to his crossword puzzles. The dizziness scared her the most. One morning, she reached for a glass in the kitchen and had to grip the counter to stay upright. The world spun. Her heart raced. That's when she went to the doctor. She thought it was her blood pressure, maybe her heart, something to do with age. Pregnancy never crossed her mind. The doctor entered the room holding a folder tight to his chest, his face unreadable. "Mrs. Grant," he began carefully, "and we've reviewed your tests." Evelyn held her breath. "You're pregnant, 4 months along." She blinked. "Oh, I'm sorry. What?" The doctor repeated it, gentler this time, but the words didn't change. Pregnant, at 70. It made no sense. Her body had shut down long ago. This had to be a mistake. "Run it again," she whispered. "We already did," the doctor replied. "One twice." Evelyn turned to Robert, expecting him to laugh or gasp or say something, but he just stared at the floor, jaw clenched, hands in his lap. He didn't even look surprised. Later that night, Evelyn sat in the car beside him, her thoughts racing. "Aren't you going to say anything?" "I don't know what to say," he muttered. That was all. Back at the hospital, the medical staff couldn't stop whispering. A 70-year-old woman, pregnant without IVF or hormone therapy? It didn't add up. After days of tests, a specialist finally sat down with Evelyn and Robert. "We believe you experienced something called ovarian resurgence," he explained. "It's rare, but it happens. In a small number of postmenopausal women, dormant ovarian tissue may unexpectedly release a viable egg, especially under unusual hormonal shifts." Evelyn said nothing. She wasn't sure what stunned her more, the diagnosis or the fact that her husband still hadn't asked a single question about the baby. Behind the scenes, the hospital's ethics committee debated whether it was even safe for Evelyn to carry to term. The risks were enormous: heart complications, organ stress, delivery failure. But Evelyn passed every check. Her heart was strong. Her labs were solid. She was determined. In the end, the doctors moved forward with the pregnancy, but not without holding their breath. And neither of them, not the doctors, not Evelyn, noticed the cold silence growing between her and Robert. Evelyn tried to enjoy the pregnancy. She followed every doctor's order. She drank more water than she ever had in her life. She stayed off her feet, ate the right things, and nodded along when nurses called her incredible. But in quiet moments, her thoughts betrayed her. Because what no one knew, not the doctors, not the media, not even her children, was that Evelyn was hiding a truth she prayed would never surface. It had been 9 months since it happened, just before the dizziness began, just before the nausea and the fatigue. Robert had been so cold then, quiet, withdrawn. He barely touched her, barely looked at her. They were like strangers in the same house. And then, he left for a week-long trip to visit his brother. That's when the past came knocking. Calvin, an old college friend, was in town for a seminar. They hadn't seen each other in 40 years. Lunch led to dinner. Dinner led to wine. Wine led to regret. It happened once, just once. Evelyn cried herself to sleep that night, knowing it meant nothing, or so she thought. When she found out she was pregnant weeks later, she did what anyone would do when backed into a corner. She reached for denial. She told herself it had to be Robert's. They had been intimate once around the same time, hadn't they? Maybe not close, but maybe close enough. She never spoke of Calvin again. She deleted the texts, erased the number, buried it all under the word miracle. And for a while, it worked. Everyone believed the narrative. The doctors had a name for it: ovarian resurgence. The media had a headline. Evelyn had a story to cling to. But Robert never bought it. He didn't accuse her, but he didn't believe it either. He was there, but not really. He rubbed her back when it hurt, but never asked about baby names. He accompanied her to appointments, but never smiled at the ultrasound. He did everything a husband should do, except connect. And that hurt more than any stretch mark or contraction ever could. Evelyn tried to start a conversation once. "I've been thinking," she said softly over dinner, "maybe we could name her after your mother?" Robert didn't even look up. "Whatever you want." The word stung. Not because he didn't care about the name, but because he didn't care about the child. That night, Evelyn sat alone in the nursery, staring at the tiny socks folded in the drawer. Her hand rested on her stomach as hope kicked softly beneath her skin. She whispered, "I don't know if he'll ever love you, but I will. I already do." She knew she couldn't hide the truth forever, but she didn't know it was about to come crashing into the light sooner than she ever expected. It happened 3 weeks early. Evelyn had just finished folding a basket of baby clothes when a sharp pain gripped her abdomen. It was different this time, not the usual aches she had learned to manage, but something deeper, stronger. She tried to call for Robert, but her voice barely carried past the hallway. A second wave of pain bent her over the edge of the crib. By the time Robert found her, she was pale and shaking. He rushed her to the hospital without a word. His grip on the steering wheel was tight. His eyes locked on the road. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, breathing through the contractions, wondering if he was more afraid of losing her or facing the truth. When they arrived, the doctors acted fast. Evelyn was already dilated. A C-section was being prepped just in case, but her body surprised them all. 70 years old, and still. She delivered naturally. The room was tense, silent, until a piercing newborn cry shattered the air. Nurses rushed in. The pediatric team surrounded the baby. A minute passed, then another. Then the sound Evelyn had longed for. She's breathing. She's perfect. Tears poured down Evelyn's cheeks. She looked to Robert, expecting something, anything. Relief, joy, awe. But he stood by the far wall, arms folded across his chest, staring at the floor. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even looked at the child. Later, in recovery, Evelyn cradled the baby against her chest. "Oh, our name is Hope," she whispered. "Well, because that's all I have left." Robert nodded, still silent. He held Hope once for a photograph, smiled for the nurses, then handed her back and walked out of the room. He never came back in that night. 2 days after they returned home, the house felt unusually quiet. Evelyn had finally gotten baby Hope to sleep in her bassinet. The living room still smelled faintly of flowers from well-wishers, but the warmth from friends and neighbors couldn't melt the frost between Evelyn and Robert. He'd been quiet, still helpful, still present, but distant. Always distant. She tried to break the silence over breakfast. "She has your lips," Evelyn said softly, pouring his coffee. Robert looked at the cup. "Maybe," he replied. Before she could respond, the phone rang. Evelyn reached for it absently, expecting another friend calling to offer congratulations. "Mrs. Grant?" The voice on the other end was professional, measured. "Yes? This is St. Clair's Medical Center. We need you and Mr. Grant to return to the hospital as soon as possible." It's regarding a set of test results from your postnatal screenings. It's important. Evelyn's hand trembled. Is something wrong with the baby? She's stable. Please be here tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. That was all. She hung up slowly and turned to Robert. Oh, they want us back. He didn't flinch. He didn't even ask why. I thought they might, he said, calmly pushing his chair back. It was just a matter of time. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the soft breaths of her daughter and the long, quiet silence of her husband in the room down the hall. Whatever was coming, she could feel it pressing on her chest. And somehow, she already knew what it would be. The next morning, Evelyn held Hope close as Robert drove them back to the hospital. Neither of them spoke. The waiting room felt colder than she remembered. A nurse escorted them into a private consultation room. Too quiet, too clean, too still. Minutes later, the door opened, and a familiar doctor entered. His expression was careful, heavy. He sat across from them, folded his hands, and began slowly. First, let me say that baby Hope is in perfect health. She's thriving. You've done everything right. Evelyn clutched her daughter tighter. However, during routine testing, a blood type inconsistency was flagged between the child and Mr. Grant. As per protocol, we conducted a DNA test to confirm paternity. She couldn't breathe. We ran the test 3 times just to rule out any error, but the results were the same. The words dropped like a hammer. Robert is not the biological father of baby Hope. The room spun. Evelyn's mouth went dry. She turned slowly toward her husband. His eyes were already closed. Evelyn stared at him, her mouth half open, hands trembling around baby Hope's tiny frame. She couldn't speak, couldn't even form a question. Robert opened his eyes, and for the first time in months, he really looked at her. I knew. The words were quiet, steady, not bitter, just tired. I knew the moment the doctor said you were pregnant. You hadn't touched me in weeks, Evelyn, maybe months. And when they said it was 4 months along, I didn't even need to do the math. Evelyn's breath caught. Then why didn't you say anything? His voice cracked, and for a moment, the man who had seemed so distant, so cold, looked impossibly vulnerable. Because I saw how you held your stomach when you thought I wasn't looking, how you whispered to her, how you cried at night but smiled through it in the morning. I knew you needed this. I just didn't know if I could survive it. She felt her chest caving in, her heart splitting wide open. I didn't plan it, she whispered. It wasn't a love affair. It was a mistake. A moment I hated myself for the second it happened. Robert didn't move. He didn't interrupt. I buried it, she continued. I told myself it didn't matter, that it couldn't possibly result in this. She looked down at Hope, at the tiny eyes staring up from her chest, innocent, fragile, blameless. But it did, and I am sorry, Robert. I am so sorry. He nodded slowly. The silence between them now wasn't cold, it was full of ache. I never hated you for it, he said. I hated that I wasn't enough, that I couldn't reach you before someone else did. Tears ran down Evelyn's cheeks. Hope didn't deserve this. No, he replied gently. But she didn't deserve to be born into shame either. His eyes dropped to the baby. His lips trembled. Then, finally, he stood and walked toward Evelyn. And for the first time since her birth, Robert reached down and picked up Hope. She didn't ask for any of this, he whispered. But she's here, and she's ours, whether blood says so or not. Evelyn wept harder than she had in years. The drive home was silent, but no longer cold. Robert held Hope in the back seat, gently humming a tune Evelyn hadn't heard in years. She watched through the rearview mirror, unable to speak. Her chest still ached from crying, but there was something else now, something she hadn't felt in months. A flicker of hope. Back at home, she placed Hope in the bassinet and sat at the edge of the couch. Robert remained standing. I don't know what happens next, he said quietly. I don't know if I can be your husband the way I used to be. Evelyn nodded slowly. She wasn't going to beg. She had broken something sacred, and she knew it. But Robert wasn't finished. But I do know this. When I held her just now, I didn't feel confusion. I didn't feel betrayal. I just felt peace. And maybe that's the only truth I need right now. She looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. You're staying? He sat beside her, not too close, not too far. For Hope? Yes. For us? He paused. I need time. Evelyn understood. Time couldn't undo what had been done, but maybe, just maybe, it could help rebuild what remained. The weeks that followed were quiet but healing. They moved slowly, carefully. Robert slept in the guest room. Evelyn didn't push. Instead, they focused on the one thing they agreed on completely: hope. Late one night, as Evelyn rocked Hope to sleep, she looked over to find Robert watching from the doorway. "You're a good mother," he said softly. Tears welled in her eyes again. "Oh, I'm trying." The seasons shifted. So did the silence in their home. Evelyn and Robert weren't the couple they once were. They didn't pretend to be. But they shared something now, more than duty, more than routine. They shared a child. Robert never said much, but one morning, he quietly filed adoption papers at the courthouse. Hope would carry his name, legally, fully, without asterisk. When Evelyn found out, she simply nodded. Emotions stuck somewhere between gratitude and grief. That night, while Hope slept, Evelyn sat alone at the kitchen table with a notepad in front of her. No rehearsed lines, just truth. She wrote, "Hope, you came when I least deserved a gift. You were born of pain, but you became my reason to keep going. I don't know what the world will tell you one day, but I want you to hear this from me. You were wanted, you are loved, and your life matters." She sealed the letter and placed it in a drawer, saving it for a time when her daughter would be old enough to understand. Later, she stepped outside and found Robert on the porch, gently rocking Hope in his arms. She sat beside him. No apology, no explanation, just presence. They didn't speak, but in that quiet, everything was still uncertain. Would he ever trust her again? Could what was broken ever feel whole again? Robert chose to stay, for Hope. But whether he should forgive Evelyn, that decision remains unfinished. If you were Robert, would you forgive her? Would you stay and try to rebuild, or walk away with peace but not partnership? Let us know your reflections in the comments below. Your words might help someone else make sense of their own story. If this story moved you, if it made you feel, reflect, or even cry, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter. Stories that stay with you long after they end. And from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for watching. We're grateful you were here, and we'll see you in the next story.